Before we wrap things up, this morning, the WWE agreed to merge with the UFC as a part of the deal with Endeavor Group to create a new company run by Ari Emanuel and Vince McMahon. What does that mean for the UFC? Let's get your reactions. Dan, we'll start with you.
Well, it's hard to speculate too much, but I will say what it doesn't mean. It probably doesn't mean more money for the fighters, unfortunately. I know we like to all get excited like we're in some episode of Succession. I haven't watched the show. I'm sure it's fine. I'm not crapping on it. But we love to get excited about these things, these big, powerful business people doing big, powerful business merge. All I care about is the fighters and what they're going to get down from it. And I'm not talking about no trickle-down theory. It is probably going to upset a lot of the general public who hates when you bring up pro wrestling. I will say, even though I don't follow pro wrestling, I absolutely respect it and its history that we share with MMA. I know that just upset so many people, probably in the chat and whoever heard this, but yes, we do have a shared history. I'm fine with that. So I'm not worried about any crossover in that ways. I'm more worried about two things: the fighter pay and how this is going to affect betting. There were talks about trying to put lines on scripted, pro wrestling stuff, which is kind of insane considering the betting scandals that we alone in the MMA space have recently been made aware of, though many of us could see this coming if we're being real here. The fact is that's a really big, quiet topic, is how it's going to affect betting in gaming on both sides. Again, mess with, take strays, call Dana White names, do whatever you want, but do not mess with their money. That's where these businesses get a little crazy. That's what I'm curious. Fighter pay and betting.
And Mike, I mean, we've seen obviously a lot of MMA fighters have a lot of love. Daniel Cormier is out there doing interviews. We've seen Masvidal crossover to pro wrestling. Do you think this is what this means, that we're going to see a lot of crossovers, or what do you think this deal means?
It's still so fresh. It's hard to know exactly where this is going to go. I mean, right now it seems like a lot of the stuff is more like behind the scenes business things, how they could leverage each other's name value and crossover audience, and having symmetry with events. Like, who knows if we're going to get maybe like a Friday night SmackDown in the same city as there's a UFC fight card on the Saturday. We saw obviously WrestleMania happen this past weekend. No UFC event. I assume that this has been something that's been in the works for a while. I don't know how far in advance that was planned, but I think it's more things like that. I mean, the stuff that Tom just hit on is obviously extremely critical. I mean, the betting stuff is particularly interesting. I'm not a huge pro wrestling guy, but I did watch, the second night of WrestleMania last night, and I saw that Roman Reigns was like a plus 450 underdog to win the main event against minus 800. And he ended up winning. So that's going to be really interesting to see how the betting stuff goes, especially in an industry where, like, as we know, it's scripted and it's hard to protect those secrets of who's going to win this big match or that big match. So that's kind of like a foundational importance here too. But yeah, I think there'll be a crossover for sure. I mean, you saw like Conor McGregor and Paul Heyman kind of going back and forth on Twitter last night. I think there'll be more things like that. Maybe a guy has a big fight and they have him on a WWE programming to do an interview, and vice versa, maybe involved in like a little angle. But I don't know if we're going to see like UFC fighters flocking over to WWE to participate in matches in mass, and vice versa with pro wrestlers coming over to do MMA and compete in UFC fights. That might happen, once in a blue moon, infrequently. Someone who's the right fit for it. But I think more so it's kind of going to be like behind the scenes brand cohesion, using the Endeavor name and the profile to get sponsorships and use similar crossover in that regard. So I think that's where the biggest impact is. If you're a hardcore UFC fan, I don't think you're dramatically or even minorly going to see the product change on either front here. I think you're still going to get your individual things, but there might just be like different planning in terms of event scheduling and all that type of stuff.
How about you, Goz? What do you think this deal means?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a long history of crossover, right? Like, and crossover with success, right? Brock Lesnar's come over here; he's won a title. Ronda Rousey went back that way; like, she won a title over there. I think she even main evented a WrestleMania. So big things have happened. I think the bigger crossover might be the fans, though, like Mike said and Dan said. I think there'll be a lot of crossover there, promoting each other and maybe winning over some fans, going both ways. It's essentially the same demographic, right, when you think about it. But Jake Paul, that's probably going to hurt him, right? I mean, I think this kind of gives a little bit of a opening for fighters to do something else other than go get beat up by Jake Paul or go do boxing. Think about a guy like a Colby Covington or or even a Conor McGregor who was kind of putting his name in the hat. Like, I think some of these people would thrive in pro wrestling. I think that would be really, really interesting. We just got to hope Dana White doesn't cross over, right? Otherwise it's Roman Reigns and Colby tonight on Raw or SmackDown or whatever the hell's going on. But another thing you want to look at is things like the slap fight, right? That might get some crossover. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll see Bob Holly slapping people. You might have some of those people coming over doing things like that. So we don't know, man. It's kind of too early, but I think business wise, it's a good move.
We saw
just one more thing, if I can chime in. I mean, I think
Yeah.
to circle back to what Dan said off the bat about fighter pay and things like that. I mean, looking at the numbers here, the UFC within this deal now valued at over $13 billion when it sold at just over $4 billion in 2016. So almost triple the value in those few years. And has the entry level UFC fighter contract tripled over that amount of time? No, it hasn't. So this is just another example as we'll sit here, how many times a year on these Mondays talking about this, for the fighters to wake up and figure out how to get your piece of the puzzle. Because no matter how many of these multi-billion or multi-million dollar deals get struck, nothing more is going to come your way unless you fight for it, unless you collectively organize to get it for yourself, because there's no handouts here. It is now a publicly traded company. They have a duty to their stockholders, to all that stuff, to make their money back, to keep the value high. And they're going to be able to manage that by keeping their financial outputs low. And that means, fighter pay, things like that. So all the fighters out there watching this, et cetera, wake up. I don't know how many times we can say it.